Before we step into the story, take a breath. Wherever you are right now, maybe it's morning and sunlight's just creeping through your window, or maybe it's late at night and you're half lost in thought. Welcome. You're about to travel back 2,000 years, to the docks of Ostia, where the Roman Empire's heartbeat pulsed not in palaces or battlefields, but in warehouses of grain and the sweat of unseen workers. Before we begin, tap that like button if you love stories that bring history alive, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I want to see just how far across time zones this journey reaches. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story that takes you deep into the forgotten corners of history, where empires rose not just by sword and fire, but by hunger and bread. Now, let's step onto the docks of Ostia. You are standing on the docks of Ostia, the bustling port at the mouth of the Tiber River, in the quiet dawn of the 1st century BCE. The sea smells faintly of oil and decay, the scent of fish and damp wood clinging to the cool air. The sky is pale grey, streaked with the lingering smoke of hundreds of lamps that burn through the night, marking the outlines of warehouses and grain silos. Everywhere, there is movement, not the feverish chaos of war, but the steady rhythm of work. Dock workers lift sacks of grain from the bellies of ships, each sack marked with a seal, Annona av et, the property of the emperor. This is not just grain. It is the lifeblood of the Roman world, a fragile thread binding the restless millions of the capital to the distant fields of Egypt, Africa, and Sicily. The empire's peace, the Pax Romana, depends on this dull, grinding labor, the weighing of sacks, the measuring of grain, the keeping of ledgers. In the time of Augustus, the first emperor, the entire political order of Rome, from senators to slaves, revolved around this daily promise that no Roman citizen would go hungry. It was Augustus who understood, more than any general before him, that victory was not just won on battlefields, but in warehouses and markets. Bread was his most effective weapon. After decades of civil war, the people of Rome were weary. They had seen armies turn against their own, temples looted, fields burned, and the city itself teeter on the edge of famine. When Augustus, then still Octavian, inherited the world from the ashes of Julius Caesar's ambition, he inherited a city terrified of hunger. The crowds that filled the forum were not chanting for freedom or vengeance. They wanted bread and certainty. So he gave them both. Under Augustus, a vast and invisible machine began to take shape, a logistical marvel that stretched from the harbors of Alexandria to the granaries of Rome. Each year, more than 200,000 tons of grain were shipped across the Mediterranean, following winds and currents that had to be measured, predicted, and obeyed. Augustus ordered new lighthouses built, ports dredged, and warehouses expanded. He appointed praefecti annonae, prefects of the grain supply, men of trusted efficiency rather than noble birth, because this was not glamorous work. It was endless calculation, ledgers and inventory lists, the recording of shipments and losses to storms or theft. For the people of Rome, this system was both miraculous and invisible. The bread simply appeared. Each morning, citizens lined up at the Horia Publica, the public granaries, to receive their rations. There were more than 150,000 registered recipients, men, women, and children, who lived entirely on the emperor's dole. Augustus had transformed what was once a chaotic republican handout into a permanent institution, the annona. It was not charity, it was control. Because whoever controlled the bread controlled the city. If you were standing beside Augustus on one of his inspection tours of Ostia, and he did visit, quietly, without ceremony, you would see not an emperor, but an administrator. He would pause at the ledgers, frown over the notations of loss due to damp grain, or smile faintly at a shipment that arrived ahead of schedule. He understood the fragility of this network. A single storm could ruin an entire season's supply. pirates, long thought suppressed, could reappear along the North African coast and seize the ships before they reached Sicily. And then there was Egypt, the golden crown of his empire. When Augustus annexed Egypt in 30 BCE after the death of Cleopatra, he did not simply gain land, he gained the empire's stomach. The Nile's fertile floods produced the grain that would feed Rome for centuries. The emperor declared Egypt his personal property, ruled not by a senator, but by a prefect answerable only to him. No senator was allowed even to visit without permission. Egypt's harvests were guarded like treasure, its granaries patrolled by soldiers, its shipyards watched by imperial agents. Each year, the fleet of naves Frumentariae, the grain ships, sailed from Alexandria to Ostia, a journey of roughly 10 days if the weather held. These ships were vast, slow-moving giants, with hulls coated in tar and sails dyed a deep ochre red. They could carry up to 400 tons of grain each. From a distance, their arrival looked almost ceremonial, a stately procession across the horizon, bringing sustenance to 1 million people who would never see the fields where their bread was grown. The first to sight them from the watchtowers of Ostia would ring a bell, and soon the city would stir. Markets would prepare, bakers would gather their apprentices, and the bureaucrats would ready their stamps and seals. Augustus had achieved something extraordinary, a peace built on paperwork and patience. Yet even in this triumph lay unease, because the system worked only as long as Augustus himself remained vigilant. The grain supply was not self-sustaining. It required endless management, inspection, and adaptation. Every delay in shipment, every theft or mold outbreak could ripple through the empire. Augustus, who had seen Rome starve in his youth, never forgot the terror of scarcity. He kept detailed notes on the state of the Annona, and in his later years, he often fretted over the efficiency of transport routes. He invested in shipbuilding subsidies, ordered the repair of harbors damaged by storms, and even considered constructing artificial lakes to store excess grain near the city. He was not a man of sudden gestures, but of steady anxieties. The Roman historians who wrote of him centuries later often glossed over these details, preferring to praise his laws, his military reforms, his building projects. But the empire's true foundation was far less glamorous: the reliable arrival of food. The poet Horace once wrote, with gentle irony, that the belly has no ears. Augustus understood this better than anyone. The people would not listen to laws or rhetoric if they were hungry. Bread was the currency of trust. And yet, even as he built this system of nourishment, the emperor lay awake at night. The empire was too large, the sea too unpredictable, the people too numerous. What if the winds failed? What if Egypt rebelled? What if, in a single season, the great chain of supply were to break? He kept no diary that has survived, but his letters to governors and prefects reveal his tone: calm on the surface, anxious beneath. The people must be kept quiet, he once wrote to his friend Agrippa. A hungry mob is no longer Roman. It was not fear of rebellion that haunted him, but the loss of order, that slow creeping return to the chaos of his youth. The Republic had fallen not only to ambition, but to famine. He would not allow that again. The irony was that the Annona, the system meant to ensure stability, also sowed dependence. The citizens of Rome grew accustomed to their grain dole, to the certainty that the emperor would feed them. Their loyalty became transactional. The moment a shipment was delayed, rumors spread that the emperor had grown weak, or that the gods were displeased. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing decades later, would mock the people for their obsession with panametiocenses, bread and circuses. But it was Augustus who had laid that foundation. At night, when the city's lamps dimmed and the streets fell silent, the emperor's palace on the Palatine Hill stood above it all, illuminated by the soft glow of oil lamps. It was said that Augustus often walked the colonnades in the early hours, unable to sleep. He would look toward the west, where the Tiber curved toward the sea, and imagine the ships that had not yet arrived. It was not glory that troubled him, but logistics. Not rebellion, but mildew. Not assassins, but the slow spoilage of grain. The empire, he realized, was not a monument of marble, but a web of obligations, fragile, invisible, and easily broken. Sometimes, he would visit the granaries in person, in disguise or with minimal escort. He would speak to the workers, inspect the records, ask how long it took to dry the grain after a rainy season. The workers would bow, not realizing who he was, and answer dutifully. They could not know that the man who stood before them had once commanded legions and remade the world. Augustus preferred these quiet inspections to triumphs. The triumphs were loud and fleeting. The warehouses were eternal. He believed that Rome's true greatness lay not in conquest, but in coordination, the ability to feed, clothe, and govern millions across continents. It was the dull heart of empire, the counting of sacks, the patching of sails, the endless shuffling of records. And yet, from this monotony arose the illusion of divine order. To be emperor was to live at the center of a machine that could never stop turning. And still, he could not help but wonder what would happen when he was gone. Who would watch the ships, and count the grain, and quiet the city when hunger whispered again through its alleys? Would Rome's peace survive the absence of its anxious watchmen? Would the next emperor remember that the empire's true foundation was not gold, but grain? When you imagine the Roman Empire, you might think first of legions, banners lifted against a blinding sun, the sound of iron on stone, the disciplined advance of an unstoppable force. But if you look closer, if you linger in the quieter corridors of history, you'll find that the empire was made less by the clang of arms than by the rhythm of counting. Counting people, counting sacks, counting measures of grain. For the Roman state, quantity was power. And nowhere was this truer than in the cura annoni, the care of the grain supply. Augustus had designed it as the empire's quiet backbone, a network of records, warehouses, harbors, and men who measured and verified everything from the fullness of a granary to the weight of a single loaf of bread. It was bureaucracy in its earliest, most powerful form, a kind of empire within the empire, ruled not by generals or priests, but by clerks and overseers. By the time Augustus reached the later years of his reign, this grain machine had become a marvel of precision. Inscriptions from the period list exact measures: the modius, the sextarius, the quadrantile. Each unit of measurement was regulated by the emperor's seal, kept in temples and public offices, a physical manifestation of trust. No merchant could sell or measure grain without comparing his weights to the official standards. The empire, as Augustus saw it, would survive not on conquest, but on standardization. Even the simplest loaf of bread became a state object, its price fixed by decree, its weight periodically inspected by magistrates. Bakers in Rome were organized into guilds and supplied flour directly from imperial warehouses. In return, they were required to sell bread at a fair price or risk exile. It was a system of invisible coercion, wrapped in the language of public service. And so the city fed itself with mathematical regularity. Imagine the sound of it, the creak of leather sacks dragged across the marble floors of the Horea Galbae, the massive imperial granaries near the Aventine Hill. Each morning, overseers would open the gates, and porters would begin the day's endless cycle. Inside the granaries, the air was heavy with the smell of chaff and dust. The walls were thick, designed to keep out rats and moisture. Every few paces, a clerk sat at a wooden table, scratching tallies onto wax tablets. 2 modii lost to damp, one might note. 3 modii short from the shipment at Terracina. Beside him, a slave stirred the air with a long rod tipped with oil-soaked rags, an ancient method to keep insects away. The work was slow, repetitive, and by all appearances dull. But to Augustus, this was where power truly resided. A city that could feed itself without panic was a city that would not revolt. The irony, of course, is that such order required endless supervision. The emperor's peace was a piece of maintenance. Each stage of the process was its own world. At the harbours, the navicularii, the shipowners, were a distinct class. They were not merchants in the modern sense, but semi-official contractors who served the emperor's supply system. Their ships were enormous and expensive, their crews bound by law to serve the state's needs first. Augustus had granted them special privileges, exemption from certain taxes, protection against lawsuits, even the right to pass on their profession to their heirs. In return, they guaranteed that a portion of their fleet would always be available for the annona. It was an early form of what we might now call state-sponsored industry, a private enterprise made public in service of empire. Still, danger was constant. The Mediterranean, though tamed by Roman naval patrols, remained unpredictable. The Mar Nostrum, our sea as the Romans called it, was a restless body. A single storm could scatter fleets, and with them, the emperor's peace. Records from the reign of Tiberius, Augustus's successor, tell of a year when the winds delayed the Alexandrian grain ships for weeks. The people of Rome grew restless. Bread prices soared. Crowds gathered in the forum, shouting for relief. Tiberius, always a man of isolation, responded coldly. He blamed the merchants, the weather, the gods, anything but his own administration. The unrest simmered for months. Only when the next fleet arrived, its holds full of Egyptian grain, did the city calm again. Augustus had feared this very scenario. He understood how fragile contentment could be, how easily the trust of a population might turn to suspicion. He had seen it during the wars of his youth, when angry crowds demanded Caesar's reforms and rioted for bread. That fear never left him. In one surviving letter to his stepson Tiberius, written perhaps in 9 BCE, Augustus refers almost tenderly to the Cura Annonai. He calls it our most sacred labor, the true work of empire. He speaks of the comfort of knowing the people sleep with full stomachs. It is a remarkably human sentiment, the voice of a man who, though ruler of the known world, worried nightly about whether ships would reach harbor. And yet, beneath the compassion lay control. For every loaf of bread given, a bond of loyalty was forged. The citizens of Rome were no longer independent consumers, but clients of the emperor. He was their provider, their guarantor, their distant father. When he distributed grain personally, as he sometimes did during festivals, he stood not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker. The ceremony was quiet, almost sacred. The people would bow as they received their rations. Some would whisper prayers. Others would simply nod, clutching their grain as if it were gold. It was not wealth that bound Rome together, but reassurance. Beyond Rome, the same principle extended outward, to the provinces, the colonies, the great web of roads and ports that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Each region had its obligations. North Africa sent grain, Spain sent oil, Gaul sent wine, and Egypt sent the abundance of the Nile. The emperor's administrators tracked it all through an immense correspondence. Couriers carried wax tablets and scrolls back and forth across the empire, filled with numbers and seals, requests and confirmations. The cursus publicus, The imperial postal service was one of Augustus's quietest achievements. Stations were built every few miles along major roads, each with fresh horses and food for the couriers. It was not built for love letters or private messages, but for the movement of reports, orders, and receipts, the lifeblood of administration. A message could reach Rome from Egypt in just under 2 weeks if the roads were clear and the weather fair. Every number, every shipment, every decision passed through this invisible system. It was the empire's nervous system, efficient, relentless, and entirely dependent on trust. At the center of it all stood the Praefectus Annonae, the prefect of the grain supply. Appointed directly by Augustus, he was one of the few equestrian officials with near senatorial authority. His office in Rome was a maze of scrolls, maps, and scales. He oversaw thousands of workers and inspectors, coordinated with provincial governors, and reported directly to the emperor. The prefect's role was thankless. Success was invisible failure, catastrophic. The first known prefect, Gaius Turanius, served Augustus faithfully for decades. He was a man of discipline, known for his meticulous handwriting and unshakable calm. Once, when a storm destroyed several warehouses along the Tiber, Augustus personally visited the site. He found Turanius already there, ankle-deep in mud, directing workers to salvage what they could. The emperor reportedly smiled and said, "You govern this city better than I govern the world." It was meant as a compliment, but perhaps also a confession. Because Augustus knew that empire was not maintained by glory, but by competence, by men like Turanius, who worked without rest to ensure that no citizen ever missed a meal. Still, even the most careful system cannot control everything. The Roman calendar, though improved by Julius Caesar's reforms, did not always align perfectly with the agricultural cycles of Egypt and Africa. Droughts, floods, or infestations could throw off the schedule. And then there was human error, the corruption of officials, the theft of grain in transit, the manipulation of records. Augustus attempted to fight these failings with regulation. He issued edicts setting maximum profits for grain merchants. He increased penalties for theft from warehouses. He even encouraged merchants to form partnerships with the state, offering partial ownership of ships in exchange for reliability. It was, in its way, an early model of state capitalism, the blending of private enterprise with public responsibility. But every solution bred new complications. Merchants complained of unfair treatment. Senators accused Augustus of undermining free trade. The emperor, patient as ever, replied that order must come before freedom, that the city could not debate philosophy on an empty stomach. Still, as the years went on, he grew weary of the constant adjustments. The system demanded endless care, and he was aging. In his final decade, Augustus increasingly withdrew to his estates in Campania, leaving much of the daily administration to Tiberius and the prefects. But even there, among the olive trees and sea air, he received daily reports. Couriers arrived at dawn, dusty from the road, carrying scrolls stamped with wax seals. He read them carefully, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. The numbers soothed him, the cargo tallies, the reports of new silos completed, the tonnage of grain in reserve. They were evidence of order, of continuity. And yet, he knew the fragility of it all. The sea could still turn violent. A single bad harvest could empty the storehouses. He had built a system so vast it could not fail in one place. But perhaps that was its danger. It could fail everywhere at once. In his old age, he began to speak more often of the gods, not as divine beings, but as metaphors for luck, for timing, for the unseen forces that made human planning seem absurd. "We build," he said once, and the winds decide. When he died in 14 CE, the machinery he had built did not falter immediately. The grain fleets continued their rhythm. The clerks continued to tally. The ovens continued to burn. Rome slept peacefully, as he had wished. But already, subtle cracks were forming. Tiberius, less patient than his predecessor, cared little for the daily management of grain. He considered such matters beneath imperial dignity. He delegated them entirely to his subordinates. The annona continued, but without Augustus's anxious supervision, the system began to drift. There were shortages in the provinces. The fleet captains grew corrupt. The prefects, once chosen for integrity, were now selected for loyalty. The machine that Augustus had built, so intricate, so precise, began to run on habit rather than care. And yet, its endurance was proof of his achievement. For more than 2 centuries, through plague, war, and fire, Rome would never again experience famine on the scale that had once threatened its survival. The system outlived its maker. Still, the question lingered. A question that Augustus himself had asked, perhaps on those sleepless nights when the lamps flickered against the marble walls of the Palatine. How long can an empire survive on structure alone, when its architect is gone? Can routine replace vigilance? Can the habit of abundance survive the loss of fear? When Augustus died, the city of Rome continued to eat. That, more than the statues or the laws, was his legacy. Each morning, as the sun rose over the rooftops, the same smell drifted through the streets, the warm, yeasty air from thousands of bakeries. The same long queues formed at the Horea Publica, where citizens came to collect their grain allotments. The same records were stamped, signed, and filed away in neat bundles. Rome, as it turned out, was capable of feeding itself without its founder's constant anxiety. But this mechanical continuity was deceptive. Beneath the smooth surface of daily life, the empire was already changing, slowly and quietly, like the settling of a great ship after its captain has gone below deck. Tiberius had inherited not just an empire, but an expectation that Rome's citizens would be fed, no matter the cost. He found little satisfaction in this duty. He was not an administrator by nature. He preferred the solitude of Capri to the crowds of the Forum. His edicts were brief, his attention intermittent. And yet, the machine still ran. The annona, once a personal project of Augustus, had become a permanent institution of state. The office of the Praefectus Annonae continued, the warehouses remained stocked, and the fleets sailed from Alexandria with punctual regularity. This was the true miracle of Augustus's design. He had built something that could endure indifference. Still, the perfection of systems always invites decay. Over time, the careful balance between state and merchant began to shift. The ship owners, the navicularii, grew powerful. They formed associations, sometimes hereditary, that operated with near autonomy. Many began to use their privileged position for personal profit, claiming imperial exemptions while quietly trading on the side. Corruption seeped into the docks and counting houses. The prefects who oversaw them, now political appointees rather than chosen administrators, often looked the other way. Reports of short shipments were explained away as storms or spoilage. A few sacks missing here, a few coins exchanged there. It was small enough to ignore, but constant enough to erode the system's integrity. Rome itself was too large, too dependent to notice at first. The bread continued to appear. The queues still formed. The illusion of abundance persisted. But Augustus's dream of perfect oversight, of a world where even mildew was catalogued, began to fade. By the 2nd century CE, Under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, the Annona had grown into a massive bureaucratic organism. Its reach extended beyond grain to include oil, wine, and even pork. Each commodity had its own chain of administrators, its own storage facilities, its own laws. The Romans called this network the cura rei frumentariae, the care of provisions. It was less a department than an empire of clerks. Hadrian, ever the planner, expanded and codified it. He built new granaries, improved Ostia's port, and commissioned detailed maps of the shipping routes from Alexandria and Carthage. His engineers even developed more sophisticated techniques for preserving grain, such as layered storage with ash and salt to deter insects. It was progress, but of a cold and mathematical kind. The emperor's personal connection to the system, that sense of vigilant responsibility Augustus had carried like a burden, was gone. The administrators now served the institution itself, not the people. The Roman state had achieved what Augustus had both desired and feared, a machine that no longer needed a human soul to function. And yet, the danger of dependence remained. The people of Rome no longer remembered a world without the Annona. Bread had become not a privilege, but a right, an expectation so absolute that any interruption was seen as an act of imperial failure. When Emperor Claudius faced a brief shortage in 51 CE, caused by storms in the Mediterranean, the crowds turned violent. They surrounded the imperial palace, shouting that the gods had cursed him. Claudius, ever the bureaucrat himself, descended to the forum and explained the situation calmly. He promised to repair the harbors, to send inspectors to Egypt, to stabilize the prices. His voice, it was said, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He understood, as Augustus had, that order was the most fragile luxury of all. Claudius's engineers went on to build one of the great marvels of Roman infrastructure, the Portus Harbor, a vast artificial basin north of Ostia. It was a fortress for commerce, capable of sheltering hundreds of ships. Completed under Nero, it symbolized the empire's belief that logistics could conquer nature. But nature, as Augustus had warned, does not yield forever. By the 3rd century, the Roman world began to shrink inward. Civil wars fractured provinces, pirates reappeared in the eastern Mediterranean, inflation gnawed at the value of the denarius. The Annona, strained beyond its design, struggled to keep up. The prefects grew desperate, commandeering ships, seizing private cargo, and rationing supplies. The Emperor Aurelian, ruling in the late 3rd century, introduced a radical reform. Instead of raw grain, citizens would receive baked bread, standardized, measured, and stamped with the imperial seal. It was an act of efficiency, but also control. Every loaf now bore the imprint of the state. The citizens, long accustomed to dependence, accepted it without protest. In time, the Annona became not just a logistical network, but a metaphor. The empire's heartbeat, steady but slowing. If you could walk through Rome in those years, the weary years between glory and decline, you might notice the same quiet rhythms that Augustus once loved. The warehouses still smelled of dust and oil. The clerks still scraped wax tablets clean to begin another day's records. The bakers still rose before dawn, kneading dough by lamplight. But the empire around them was changing in ways they could not see. The frontiers were crumbling, the legions thinning, the provinces restless. And still, the bread arrived. For generations, emperors had measured their legitimacy by this one metric. Was the city fed? The answer, for a surprisingly long time, remained yes. Even as marble temples fell into ruin, even as emperors were overthrown, the Annona endured. It outlasted dynasties, invasions, and plagues. This endurance was not glorious, but it was astonishing. It was the triumph of habit over chaos, of ledgers over swords. In the end, Augustus's system survived him for more than 400 years. When the Western Empire finally fell, in the 5th century, it was not famine that destroyed it, but disconnection. The breaking of roads, the silencing of ports, the loss of coordination. Rome's last grain fleets never arrived. The harbors at Ostia and Portus fell silent. The warehouses emptied, their massive doors left to rot. And yet, the memory of that order, the promise of steady bread and predictable peace, lingered for centuries. Medieval kings would dream of recreating it. Modern governments would study it. Economists would cite it as one of the earliest examples of centralized welfare. But for Augustus, it had never been about generosity. It was about control through calmness, the management of hunger, the quieting of fear. He understood something timeless, that civilization depends not on grandeur, but on the smoothness of ordinary days. In a sense, every government since has shared his nightmare. To govern millions is to fear the small things, the delay of a ship, the rot of a storehouse, the anger of a crowd that feels forgotten. The same anxieties that kept Augustus pacing his palace still echo in modern forms. Supply chains, markets, rationing, logistics. The tools have changed, but the worry is eternal. And so, as you imagine the emperor standing on the docks of Ostia, watching his ships fade into the horizon, try to see him not as marble or myth, but as a man of lists and ledgers, haunted not by ambition, but by the possibility of failure. He built an empire out of ordinary labor, and its endurance was his only peace. Perhaps that is the quiet truth of Rome, that its greatness lay not in conquest, but in the dull, relentless patience of keeping people fed. And still, one wonders, if Augustus were to wake and walk among us today, to see the world's endless trade, its warehouses and ports and supply routes stretching across oceans, would he be comforted by our abundance? Or would he see, beneath it all, the same fragile dependence, the same haunting question that kept him awake on the Palatine? Who watches the ships now? And what happens when they do not come? You wake in a quiet corridor of the Palatine Hill, in a room that smells faintly of parchment and lamp oil. It is morning in the year 47 CE, and the emperor is already awake. Not the emperor you might imagine, not a warrior in bronze, not a marble god, but a stooped grey-haired man bent over a pile of scrolls. His name is Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, 4th emperor of Rome, and he is surrounded by paperwork. To his right, clerks murmur softly, dipping their styluses into ink and noting his every comment. To his left, a slave unrolls a new petition from a provincial governor, a request about a missing water conduit in Antioch. Claudius pauses, blinks rapidly, and begins to dictate a reply. His voice is quiet but deliberate. Let the engineer Mucianus inspect the damage and report in 30 days. If the expense exceeds expectation, refer to the treasury. He signs the tablet with his seal. Another petition awaits. Claudius, unlike his predecessors, did not command legions or conquer provinces. He ruled instead through documents, through memoranda, reports, tables of numbers, and letters to distant officials. He was not the emperor of spectacle, but of administration. For a man mocked in his youth as a stuttering scholar, it was a strange kind of triumph. Claudius had not been destined for power. Born in 10 BCE, he was the nephew of Tiberius and the grandson of Mark Antony. Yet from childhood, he had been dismissed by his family as weak and strange. He limped, he stammered, and his head jerked when he spoke. The royal household considered him an embarrassment, a living reminder of mortality amid divine pretensions. The historians, Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, would later describe him as awkward, timid, and bookish. He was often left behind during public ceremonies, hidden away in the libraries of the Palatine, where he studied the old records of Rome's republic. There, among the dust and silence, Claudius discovered something the rest of his family ignored: the machinery of government. He learned how magistrates recorded their decrees, how provinces sent tax reports, how senators debated laws, and, more importantly, how every great decision depended on the clerks and scribes who preserved it. Where others saw boredom, Claudius saw the skeleton of empire. When he finally became emperor in 41 CE, it was almost by accident. His nephew Caligula had been assassinated by his own guards after 4 years of madness and cruelty. The conspirators were still searching for new leaders when they found Claudius trembling behind a curtain in the palace. Rather than kill him, they declared him emperor. The Senate hesitated. They saw him as a fool, unfit for rule. But the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, supported him, and in the confusion of the moment, Claudius accepted the purple. He was 50 years old, untested, and surrounded by enemies. And so, he did what he had always done. He read. He studied the records left by Augustus and Tiberius. He opened the archives that most emperors ignored. He consulted the clerks, the secretaries, the accountants, the quiet men who remembered how things actually worked. While his predecessors had sought power through charisma, Claudius sought it through comprehension. He would rule the empire by understanding its paperwork. Rome under Claudius was a city of documents. Every decision, no matter how small, was written down. Petitions arrived daily from across the empire, from Britain, from Syria, from the deserts of Africa. Some concerned military matters, but most were simple and mundane: disputes over property, irrigation, taxation, or trade. Claudius insisted on reading them all. His secretaries complained that the emperor's attention to detail was excessive. He reviewed census lists, edited public edicts, even corrected spelling errors in provincial inscriptions. When a governor sent a report written in poor Latin, Claudius reportedly returned it with grammatical notes in the margin. To his critics, this seemed absurd, an emperor wasting his time on clerical minutiae. But Claudius saw it differently. The empire, he believed, was too large for any single man to control by will alone. It must be ruled through process. Power is preserved, he once said, by those who preserve the records. To make his vision real, Claudius reorganized nearly every aspect of imperial administration. He created new secretariats, offices for petitions, finance, justice, and correspondence, each staffed by freedmen, former slaves who owed their careers entirely to him. These men became the true engines of the Roman state: Pallas, Narcissus, Callistus, and Polybius. The senatorial elite despised them. To give freedmen such authority was unthinkable. They called Claudius a puppet of slaves. But the emperor trusted them more than the aristocrats, who had conspired against every ruler before him. His freedmen were loyal, efficient, and above all, literate. They handled the empire's mountains of paperwork with precision, translating his ideas into decrees that could be implemented across thousands of miles. Through them, Claudius built something new: a civil service. For the first time, the empire's administration began to resemble a modern bureaucracy, a hierarchy of specialized offices, each with its own records and accountability. It was dull, methodical, and profoundly effective. The rhythm of Claudius's court was that of an office. At dawn, Scribes brought the day's petitions. The emperor read them as he ate a light breakfast: bread, olives, and watered wine. His freedmen summarized longer documents, marking key lines with bits of colored ribbon. By mid-morning, the courtiers gathered for the Concilium Principis, the emperor's private council. There were no grand speeches or theatrical gestures, only discussions of logistics, revenue, and legal precedent. Claudius asked precise questions. How many soldiers are stationed in Mauritania? How long does it take a messenger to reach Alexandria? What are the annual grain losses to spoilage in Ostia? He recorded everything. Even his letters were models of order. One survives, preserved in bronze, sent to the citizens of Alexandria. In it, he reprimands them for civil unrest and reminds them, in elegantly bureaucratic language, that the empire depends on peace and obedience. The tone is calm, almost weary. Let none forget, he writes, that harmony is the strength of Rome. For Claudius, paperwork was not a burden. It was the substance of rule itself, the quiet, written confirmation that chaos could be contained. There is an odd stillness to his reign when viewed from afar. While other emperors built monuments or led armies, Claudius seemed content to regulate. His greatest achievements were administrative: the expansion of citizenship, the reorganization of provincial boundaries, the reform of legal courts. He improved the postal service, expanded the road networks, and completed the long-delayed aqueduct known as the Aqua Claudia. Each project was recorded meticulously in the archives, complete with expenditures and progress reports. The historian Tacitus, who disliked him, mocked this tendency. He wrote that Claudius governed by notes and scribbles, not by vision. But this was precisely the point. Claudius did not seek vision, he sought verification. His empire was a ledger, and he, its patient accountant. To understand his world, imagine the daily life of one of his clerks, perhaps a man named Gaius, a freedman of middle rank working in the Accognitionibus, the office of petitions. Gaius begins before sunrise. His chamber is dimly lit by a single oil lamp. On his desk are stacks of wax tablets, each containing an appeal from somewhere in the empire: a dispute over inheritance in Hispania, a complaint about tax collectors in Gaul, a request for permission to build a temple in Asia Minor. He reads, summarizes, and attaches a small tag with the petitioner's name and origin. By midday, he delivers the tablets to the imperial office, where they are sorted according to topic. Some will reach Claudius's personal attention, most will be handled by the secretariat. It is monotonous work, but it keeps the empire moving. The petitions themselves are strangely human. Some are desperate pleas, others carefully phrased arguments in formal Latin. They reveal a world of ordinary concerns: land boundaries, marriage contracts, debts, and grievances. Through these documents, Claudius glimpsed the lives of his subjects more vividly than any emperor before him. For him, administration was a form of empathy. To read was to rule. But there was a darker side to this order. The bureaucracy Claudius built could be used for surveillance as easily as for service. His freedmen maintained secret archives, noting the activities of senators, governors, and generals. Reports flowed constantly from the provinces: who met with whom, who spoke against the emperor, who seemed too ambitious. The emperor's reliance on paperwork became a form of paranoia. Every letter was a potential weapon, every missing document a potential conspiracy. By 48 CE, Claudius had begun to suspect even his own family. His wife Messalina was accused of plotting against him. The records were assembled, the evidence copied and sealed. Claudius reviewed the documents in silence, his face pale and unreadable. When the charges were confirmed, he signed her death warrant with the same stylus he used for routine decrees. It was an act not of rage, but of procedure. The machine he had built demanded consistency. The senators whispered that Rome had become a paper empire, that decisions no longer flowed from the Senate House, but from the emperor's desk. They mocked his freedmen as petty tyrants, and yet they obeyed their orders. Claudius, perhaps, did not care. The Senate had mocked him all his life. He found more dignity in the routine of record-keeping than in their empty debates. He once said, "I have been laughed at for studying history, but who laughs when history is being written?" He was right. The decrees of his reign filled volumes. Some survive still, inscribed on stone, neat and precise, the handwriting of a man who believed that permanence could be achieved through paperwork. Late at night, when the palace had grown quiet, Claudius would often sit alone in his study, reading old records from the Republic, the laws of Cicero's time, the ledgers of old magistrates. He was fascinated by continuity, by the way that institutions could outlast the men who served them. He once wrote, in a passage quoted by later historians, "Men perish, but the offices remain. It is not kings who rule the world, but the habits they leave behind." Outside, the torches of the night watch flickered along the palace walls. The city below slept. In his mind, Claudius saw not the chaos of politics, but the slow, deliberate heartbeat of administration. The empire reduced to scrolls and signatures, stable and silent. Yet one question lingered, even as he worked through his endless petitions. Can an empire survive if its ruler becomes only a clerk? Can order itself become a kind of weakness, a refuge from decision? Claudius believed that peace lay in paperwork, but as the empire expanded and bureaucracy deepened, others began to wonder whether the documents ruled the man and not the other way around. You can almost hear it, the soft scrape of a stylus on wax, the faint whisper of papyrus being rolled open, the slow rhythm of bureaucracy at work. Rome under Claudius was not a city of conquerors and gladiators, but of clerks, a civilization humming beneath the weight of its own record-keeping. To understand the empire at mid-century, one must imagine the physical reality of its paperwork. The scrolls, tablets, and codices that filled storerooms from the Palatine to Alexandria were not metaphors, they were literal monuments of administration. The imperial archives, known as the tabularium, were expanded under Claudius, their stone halls stacked high with wax tablets and scrolls bound in red cord. There were lists of citizens, tax accounts, military rosters, property boundaries, grain shipments, birth and death records. The scale of documentation was staggering, and yet this was what held the empire together. If Augustus had given Rome peace through armies, Claudius gave it peace through filing. Each morning began with the shuffle of sandals through marble corridors. Freedmen's secretaries, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, moved between offices like parts of a vast mechanical body. Messages were carried by footmen in tunics marked with colored ribbons to denote the department. Green for petitions, blue for finance, white for correspondence. The emperor's signature, pressed into wax by his seal, became the empire's heartbeat. Claudius himself was said to spend hours in the libelles, the office responsible for petitions. There, he reviewed matters that ranged from the absurd to the significant. One petition came from a town in Gaul, requesting a tax exemption because their temple had been destroyed by lightning. Another from a widow in Asia Minor, asking the emperor to confirm her late husband's will. Claudius read them all, his stammered Latin careful and deliberate. When the emperor issued his response, it became imperial law, not through spectacle or decree, but through notation. This transformation, from ruler to registrar, was something new in human governance. The senators of Rome, accustomed to oratory and pomp, looked on in disbelief as Claudius's freedmen gained influence. Pallas, the the chief of finance, managed the empire's revenues with the precision of an accountant. He tracked expenditures for aqueduct repairs, military rations, and temple restorations. His ledgers became so essential that senators began to petition him rather than the emperor. Narcissus, the head of correspondence, was effectively the voice of the emperor to the provinces. His command of Greek and Latin allowed him to draft letters that blended firmness with civility. Provincial governors dreaded his missives, knowing they represented the emperor's full authority. Callistus oversaw petitions and legal appeals, deciding which cases reached the emperor's eyes. These men, former slaves all, were the architects of the Paper Palace, a government that functioned less by personal power than by documentation. They were not loved. Tacitus, with the disdain of an aristocrat, accused them of corruption and greed. But even he could not deny their efficiency. Rome, for all its vastness, ran smoothly under their hands. Claudius's reliance on freedmen was not merely pragmatic, it was philosophical. He believed that loyalty should come from merit, not birth. The senatorial class, in his view, was too attached to tradition and pride. Freedmen, bound by gratitude and ambition, were more reliable. He formalized their offices, giving them titles and salaries. Each department kept duplicate records, one set for the emperor's archives, another for public use. Every decision was logged, indexed, and sealed. This dual system created something remarkable: accountability. For the first time, provincial governors were required to submit written reports on their administration, which could be compared to citizen complaints or tax receipts. Fraud, once hidden in verbal transactions, now left a paper trail. To the senators, this was tedious. To Claudius, it was progress. He once remarked, according to the historian Dio Cassius, that nothing decays faster than a spoken promise. So he built a government of writing. The imperial bureaucracy stretched far beyond Rome. In distant provinces, local officials learned to speak the language of paperwork, Latin forms, Greek clauses, the standardized salutations of imperial correspondence. Claudius's reforms in provincial administration were especially significant. He standardized tax assessments, requiring each region to maintain detailed censuses of population and property. Governors who failed to submit accurate reports faced investigation. In North Africa, new registries were created to record grain production and shipment, a lifeline for feeding the capital. In Britain, recently conquered by Claudius's legions, clerks followed the soldiers to establish Roman records, the first censuses, the first written property boundaries. Everywhere, the empire was translated into numbers, names, and documents. To a modern reader, this may seem natural, but in the ancient world, such systematic record-keeping was revolutionary. Most empires before Rome ruled through personal command and oral tradition. Claudius made writing itself a tool of empire. Paperwork was not merely an annoyance, it was a form of control. Claudius's love of records extended to history itself. He spent his leisure hours composing books on Etruscan religion, on the Carthaginian wars, on the history of the Roman alphabet. He was a historian emperor, the kind who believed that every event should be documented, every precedent noted. He even proposed reforms to the Latin alphabet, suggesting the addition of new letters to represent sounds that Latin lacked. Few adopted them, but it reflected his conviction that writing could improve society, that the shape of letters mattered as much as the shape of laws. He also commissioned the cataloguing of Rome's archives. Old republican decrees were recopied, damaged records restored. The past, like the present, was to be preserved. In one surviving inscription, Claudius writes, "To forget is to err twice, once in deed and again in memory." The statement could have been his motto, but bureaucracy, once created, has its own gravity. The freedmen's power grew with every record they controlled. They decided which petitions reached the emperor, which letters were answered, which decrees were copied and distributed. Soon, access to the emperor became access to information, and information was power. Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus developed rivalries. They cultivated clients among senators and generals, each promising to manage imperial decisions in their favor. Rome's aristocracy, unable to destroy the system, learned instead to navigate it. The empire became a network of favors disguised as files. Claudius perhaps sensed this. He once joked, according to Suetonius, that he was a man surrounded by secretaries who need secretaries of their own. He laughed, but the laughter was weary. Bureaucracy, for all its order, breeds suspicion. Claudius's administrative reforms made it easier to monitor others and harder to trust them. The freedmen kept records of senators' behavior, tracking correspondence and travel. Surveillance became paperwork. When conspiracies were reported, the emperor demanded written proof. Accusations came in the form of signed statements, evidence in triplicate, testimonies sealed with wax. The legal procedures of treason grew increasingly complex. The Senate debated not guilt, but the correct filing of charges. The machinery of government had begun to devour itself. Nowhere is this clearer than in the case of Messalina, Claudius's wife. Her downfall in 48 CE began as rumor, whispers recorded by Narcissus, who compiled reports from palace informants. Each statement was copied, compared, and attached to others. The freedmen assembled a case as though preparing an audit. When Claudius was away at Ostia inspecting the harbour works, Messalina was accused of marrying another man in a mock ceremony, a public humiliation to the emperor. Narcissus presented the evidence in writing, testimonies, names, dates. The emperor, confused and heartbroken, reviewed the documents silently. The bureaucratic process that had governed the empire now governed his personal life. Messalina was executed without trial. The orders were signed in proper form, countersigned by Narcissus. The bureaucracy had spoken. After her death, Claudius grew more withdrawn. The palace became quieter, more procedural. His freedmen gained even greater authority. Every decree required review. Every audience required permission. The Senate became a ceremonial body, rubber-stamping decisions already finalized by secretaries. Rome was now ruled by files, folders, and the flow of ink. To later generations, this period would appear lifeless. But in truth, it was one of the most stable eras in early imperial history. The borders were secure, the treasury was solvent, the city functioned. The dullness of Claudius's rule was, paradoxically, its strength. He had built a government that could operate without passion, a machine of continuity, insulated from the chaos of personality. Yet, as with all systems, the bureaucracy began to outlive its creator. The freedmen, now immensely wealthy, became political actors in their own right. They could make or break senators, influence appointments, shape laws. When Claudius eventually remarried to Agrippina the Younger, the freedmen adjusted accordingly, aligning themselves with the new power in the palace. Narcissus favored the old order, loyal to Claudius. Pallas, however, supported Agrippina and her son, the young Nero. The conflict between them would define the final years of Claudius's life. The paper palace, once a symbol of order, had become a battleground of documents. By 53 CE, Claudius was aging. His eyesight dimmed, his stammer worsened. He spent long evenings surrounded by scrolls, reading reports that blurred before him. He often remarked that he felt more like a clerk than a ruler. His hands, once steady, now trembled as he wrote. The freedmen continued their work efficiently, almost too efficiently. The system no longer needed him. In one of his final recorded statements, he told the Senate, "Let those who love procedure remember that order without wisdom is but a chain." Perhaps he sensed what was coming, the slow replacement of reason with routine. The empire Claudius built would endure for centuries, but the habits he instilled, reliance on secretaries, dependence on written control, would also shape the corruption of later emperors. When he died in 54 CE, perhaps poisoned by Agrippina, the machinery of government continued without pause. The petitions were read, the decrees issued, the records filed. The empire no longer needed the man who had created it. Still, one wonders as the candles flicker low in that vast archive. Did Claudius find comfort in his order, or did he suspect that the papers had begun to rule him? It is autumn of the year 54 CE. The palace of Claudius stands quiet under the fading light, its corridors lined with the smell of wax and old papyrus. Somewhere in the distance, a reed pen scratches against parchment, an imperial secretary finishing the day's reports. The emperor is old now, his body failing, but the machinery he built hums on without him. The petitions continue to arrive, the clerks continue to copy, the freedmen continue to direct the flow of documents that define the empire. Rome has become a living archive. Claudius sits at his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he seals a decree. His freedman Pallas stands beside him, silent and watchful. The order concerns a minor tax adjustment in a province near the Rhine, one of countless such decisions that pass through his hands each week. To anyone else, it might seem trivial. To Claudius, it is the rhythm of rule. His empire exists not in marble or conquest, but in such quiet acts, the sealing of wax, the confirmation of form. He does not yet know that this will be one of his last decrees. By the final years of Claudius's reign, the system he created had become self-sustaining. Every department, petitions, finance, correspondence, justice, operated with mechanical precision. The freedmen at their head were effectively ministers, though Rome had no such title. Narcissus still oversaw communications, ensuring that every letter from a governor or general reached the emperor's review table. Pallas controlled the treasury, balancing accounts with near mathematical obsession. Claudius had achieved what no emperor before him had managed, an empire that could run, at least temporarily, without its ruler. It was not built for speed, but for endurance. The provinces functioned, the armies were supplied, the aqueducts flowed. The daily monotony of Rome was a kind of peace, the peace of record-keeping. And yet, beneath the calm surface of bureaucracy, human ambitions stirred. When Claudius married Agrippina the Younger in 49 CE, the Paper Palace gained a new occupant, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and calculated charm. Agrippina understood better than most that the empire was no longer ruled by legions or senators, but by documents. To control access to the emperor's paperwork was to control the emperor himself. She quickly learned the habits of the administrative machine. She befriended Pallas, whose loyalty she secured through wealth and flattery. Narcissus, however, remained suspicious of her influence, loyal as he was to Claudius's first principles. Through Pallas, Agrippina ensured that her petitions, and those of her allies, reached the emperor's desk first. She arranged for her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus soon to be Nero, to be adopted by Claudius. The paperwork was immaculate, properly witnessed and sealed. Rome would remember it as one of the most consequential signatures in history. Claudius, though no fool, had grown weary. His memory faltered, the mass of reports before him seemed endless. He complained that even his dreams were filled with petitions. Last night, he reportedly said, "I imagined myself signing a decree that I might sleep an hour longer." But the work never ended. There was always another document, another minor appeal, another administrative adjustment to approve. His freedmen shielded him from the noise of politics, or so they claimed. In truth, they filtered what he saw. They curated his world through paperwork. If a letter never reached the emperor, it did not exist. And so, the man who had once believed that writing preserved truth found himself imprisoned by it. The circumstances of Claudius's death remain uncertain. Ancient sources, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, all suggest poison. Agrippina, they imply, arranged it, fearing that the emperor might favor his biological son, Britannicus, over her own Nero as successor. The story, as the historians tell it, unfolds like one of Claudius's own bureaucratic dramas, quiet, methodical, written in the margins of other people's records. A dish of mushrooms was served at a banquet. The emperor ate. He began to feel ill. His physicians, uncertain, administered further treatments, one of which, they say, was itself poisoned. Whether true or not, Claudius died that night. What is remarkable is not the method, but the response. Even as the emperor's body cooled, the bureaucracy continued. Narcissus ensured that the formal announcement of death was written and sealed. Pallas coordinated the transfer of authority to Nero, the adopted heir. The Senate was informed by official letter. The succession proceeded smoothly, as if Claudius had merely stepped away from his desk. There were no riots, no mutinies, no chaos, only the sound of styluses on wax. Claudius was buried with honor, deified by decree, and quickly forgotten. But his archives remained. The clerks continued their routines, indifferent to the name of the man whose seal now adorned the imperial decrees. The files of Claudius, his annotations, his corrections, his careful marginal notes, were copied for posterity. Some would be quoted centuries later by scholars who marveled at his precision. Even Nero, in his early years, benefited from the stability Claudius had built. The bureaucracy ensured a smooth flow of taxes and grain, allowing the young emperor to pursue his own ambitions of art and spectacle. The empire, for a time, ran itself. Claudius's bureaucratic legacy endured far beyond his lifetime. His freedmen, though many were later executed or exiled, had institutionalized something profound: the idea that the emperor ruled through the written word. Future emperors would inherit not only a throne, but a system, the scrinia, or bureaus of imperial correspondence. By the 2nd century, under emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, this administrative tradition had matured into a professional civil service. Governors were chosen for competence rather than lineage. Records were kept in triplicate. Decisions were logged in permanent archives. The empire's continuity, the reason it could survive weak or corrupt emperors, came from this Claudian foundation. He had replaced charisma with paperwork, and in doing so, made Rome immortal. What then was Claudius's true gift? Perhaps it was not his intelligence, nor even his administrative skill, but his temperament. He was patient. He believed in procedure. He trusted the slow processes of verification. Where Caligula had ruled by impulse and Tiberius by fear, Claudius ruled by form. To modern eyes it might seem dull, the emperor as office manager. Yet history is shaped as much by paper as by blood. Every empire that followed, Byzantine, Ottoman, British, inherited this lesson. The power to record is the power to endure. Claudius, mocked by his contemporaries as timid and pedantic, had understood something timeless: that the greatest stability is found not in glory, but in administration. But every system exacts a price. The bureaucracy that Claudius built made the empire efficient, but it also made it distant. Power became impersonal, mediated through layers of clerks and secretaries. The emperor was no longer seen, only written to. For the citizens of Rome, this was both comfort and alienation. A farmer in Gaul could appeal directly to the emperor, yet would never know if his words were read by the man himself or by a freedman in the capital. The empire had become abstract, a network of correspondence rather than a community. And as centuries passed, this abstraction deepened. Emperors came and went, but the paperwork remained. Edicts were issued automatically. Laws were recopied by scribes who no longer remembered their purpose. Claudius's dream of order had outlived its meaning. The historian Josephus, writing decades later, praised Claudius for his fairness and attention to detail. He governed, Josephus said, not by passion, but by letters. Others were less kind. Tacitus dismissed him as a man ruled by his freedmen. Seneca, who served Nero, mocked the idea of a pedant emperor whose greatest accomplishment was filing. But even their scorn could not erase his influence. Modern scholars, studying the administrative papyri of Egypt or the inscriptions of Gaul, still find Claudius's fingerprints, his handwriting, his decrees, his reforms. The mundane rhythm of empire he created still echoes through the layers of history. In a sense, every tax form, every census, every bureaucratic institution in the modern world is a faint descendant of his dream. Imagine for a moment the afterlife Claudius might have desired. Not the fiery heroics of Augustus or the divine spectacle of Nero, but a silent archive, shelves of scrolls arranged in perfect order, every petition answered, every record preserved. He would walk through that endless library, reading reports of aqueducts and harvests, satisfied that all was recorded, all was known. In such a vision, history itself becomes an empire of paperwork, a record of human striving, mistakes catalogued and corrected, the dull persistence of civilization. Claudius's immortality was not in the marble of statues, but in the endurance of the administrative mind. It is tempting to dismiss bureaucracy as boring, as lifeless. Yet the Roman Empire, in its greatest centuries, survived because of men like Claudius, men who believed that order mattered more than grandeur. The Senate, the legions, even the emperors themselves were transient, but the documents remained. And so, in the flickering lamplight of that long-ago palace, the image of Claudius persists. A tired man with ink-stained fingers, bent over his desk, bringing an empire to life, one decree at a time. History remembers the conquerors, but civilization endures through the clerks. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear the rustle of parchment in the night, the whisper of an emperor's hand signing yet another petition, trying to hold the world together through the fragile permanence of words. Was it order he sought, or simply peace? Was he preserving Rome, or only distracting himself from its inevitable decay? The records do not say. They only endure. You are standing in the streets of ancient Rome, long before the fire. It is a humid night in the summer of 63 CE. The air smells faintly of olive oil, ash, and human sweat. The streets are narrow, the buildings tall and haphazard, leaning toward one another like drunks after a feast. Above you, laundry hangs between windows, limp in the heat. The lamps of taverns flicker below. You hear the sound of wheels against cobblestones, the bark of dogs, the distant rhythm of hammers in a workshop that never seems to sleep. Rome, for all its grandeur, is a city made of wood. The temples are marble, the palaces are stone, but the insulae, the vast apartment blocks that house most of the city's 1 million inhabitants, are fragile constructions of timber and plaster. Fire is not an accident in this world. It is a fact of life. Before Nero's infamous fire, smaller blazes were common. Every few weeks some neighborhood would burn, a kitchen flame gone astray, a candle overturned, a baker careless with his oven. Rome's residents lived in constant awareness of flame. They kept buckets of water by their doors. They knew which streets offered escape and which were dead ends. In the Suburra, the city's crowded working-class district, the smell of smoke was almost comforting, a familiar presence, like the sea breeze to a sailor. The Senate had issued regulations, of course. Augustus had created a special corps to combat fires, the vigils, often translated as the night watch. But by the time of Nero, their duties had expanded far beyond firefighting. They were the empire's first civil service of safety, fire inspectors, constables, and peacekeepers all at once. The vigils were not soldiers, though they marched in formation. They were not slaves, though many had once been. They were organized into 7 cohorts, each responsible for 2 of the city's 14 districts. About 1,000 men per cohort, a total of roughly 7,000 across Rome. Their headquarters was the excubatorium, a simple but sturdy barracks filled with buckets, hooks, axes, and pumps. They patrolled at night with torches, calling out the hours and keeping watch for suspicious smoke. When fire broke out, they rushed toward it, forming bucket lines from the nearest fountain or aqueduct. They used siphones, early water pumps operated by teams of men, and corvi, long iron hooks used to tear down burning walls. Their work was dangerous, exhausting, and thankless. They were mocked as bucket men and lamp watchers, but they were the difference between a small blaze and a city-wide catastrophe. Imagine one of them now, a man named Gaius Marcellus, a freedman in his 30s, posted in the 3rd cohort near the Circus Maximus. His shift begins at dusk. He dons a short tunic, a leather cap, and a belt with a small dagger. His tools are simple: a torch, a horn for signaling, and a rope. He and his fellow vigils patrol the narrow streets, listening for the faint crackle that every Roman fears. At each corner, they pause to check for illegal fire pits or open lamps. In the tenements, they knock on doors, reminding residents to douse their cooking flames before sleeping. The work is monotonous but vital. A single unattended lamp could destroy an entire block. As the hours pass, Gaius records his patrol on a wax tablet: times, routes, observations. If he finds a building with flammable rubbish piled near a wall, he marks it for inspection the next day. These reports are later delivered to the Tribunus Vigilum, the watch commander, who decides whether fines should be issued. Rome's bureaucracy of fire prevention, tedious, detailed, endlessly repetitive, was perhaps the only thing keeping the city from consuming itself. By dawn, the streets grow quiet again. Gaius returns to the barracks, his tunic streaked with soot. He will sleep a few hours before resuming duty. In his mind, he replays the night's sounds: the crackle of coals, the hiss of oil lamps being snuffed out, the murmur of drunks stumbling home. The danger has passed, but only for now. Everyone knows that one day, a fire will come that no bucket line can stop. Even the vigils know this. They speak of it sometimes, in low tones, over cups of watered wine. The way the wind can turn a spark into a storm. The way the city's buildings lean too close together. The way the gods, perhaps, might grow tired of Rome's arrogance. They joke about it, because joking is easier than fear. But each man has seen enough to know that the joke hides truth. When Nero came to power in 54 CE, the Vigiles found themselves suddenly noticed. Nero, unlike his predecessors, fancied himself a man of the people, or at least of spectacle. He took an interest in the daily mechanics of the city. He toured the workshops, questioned artisans, and even attended inspections by the night watch. Suetonius later claimed he once donned a simple cloak and accompanied the Vigiles on patrol, curious to see Rome's underbelly. Whether or not this story is true, Nero did expand the corps' authority. He ordered more stations built, improved their equipment, and issued decrees regulating building materials. Walls, he declared, must be plastered with gypsum to resist flame. Roofs should be tiled, not thatched. The use of open fires near wooden balconies was restricted. For a time, it seemed that the emperor's obsession with control, often mocked by the elite, might actually save the city. The Vigiles, for once, felt respected. But bureaucracy, like embers, burns slowly. The regulations were ambitious, yet enforcement was inconsistent. Many landlords ignored the rules. Inspections were delayed, reports misplaced. The Senate balked at the cost of compliance. By 64 CE, Rome remained a labyrinth of wood and straw, connected by a maze of overhanging balconies. The bakeries burned hot, the lamps burned low, and the Vigiles, overworked and underpaid, continued their nightly rounds. The first months of that year were unusually dry. The Tiber ran low, and the winds from the sea carried dust instead of rain. Small fires flared across the city, none catastrophic, but all reminders. In the barracks, Gaius and his comrades grew uneasy. They noticed how easily sparks carried across rooftops, how quickly dry timbers caught. Their reports, written in neat Latin on wax, began to sound like warnings. The insula, at the Vecus Tuscus, leans dangerously. The bakeries of the Aventine lack proper water access. The wind from the southwest grows strong at dusk. The warnings went unnoticed. Then came the night. July 18th, 64 CE. It began, according to later accounts, in the shops beneath the Circus Maximus, a district packed with wooden stalls selling oil, cloth, and household goods. The flames spread upward, leaping from awning to awning. The Vigiles were the first to see it. A patrol near the Aventine saw the glow, heard the distant cries. The alarm horn sounded, a long, low note that sent men running from every cohort. Within minutes, the sky turned orange. The watch commander ordered the bucket lines formed, but the heat was too intense. The wind carried sparks across the rooftops, igniting buildings faster than they could be torn down. By dawn, half the city's southern districts were burning. The Vigiles fought desperately, hacking through walls, carrying the wounded, collapsing buildings deliberately to create fire breaks. They were trained for fire, but not for a fire like this. In the aftermath, historians would argue over causes. Some said Nero had ordered the fire to make room for his new palace. Others blamed careless merchants or divine punishment. But among the Vigiles, the truth was simpler. The fire was the city itself. Rome's density, its construction, its indifference to safety, all had made the disaster inevitable. When the flames finally died, 6 days later, 2/3 of the city lay in ruins. And yet, amid the devastation, the Vigiles began their second task: documentation. They recorded which buildings had burned, which remained standing, how many bodies were found. Their scribes worked among the ashes, compiling lists for the imperial treasury and the Senate. It was dull, morbid work. But without those records, Rome could not rebuild. For months afterward, the smell of smoke lingered in every district. Yet within the excubatorium, the scratch of styluses on wax began again. Even in destruction, the paperwork continued. The fire inspectors of Rome had become historians of catastrophe. And as Nero planned his new golden city, the men of the vigils found themselves caught between obedience and guilt, the silent witnesses to an empire burning itself from within. They had done their duty, but had it mattered? Could any bureaucracy save a city so determined to ignore its own fragility? The smoke had cleared, but the smell never left. In the months after the Great Fire of 64 CE, Rome was a patchwork of ruin and rebirth, a city of rubble, scaffolding, and weary optimism. The vigils, those watchmen of the night, had become daytime laborers. Their duties now included guarding construction sites, recording claims of property loss, and supervising the transport of stone and timber. The air was thick with dust. Every corner of the city hummed with rebuilding, 1,000 hammers striking in rhythmic defiance of despair. To most Romans, it was a time of confusion. To the vigils, it was a test of patience and endurance. They had seen their warnings ignored, their city burn, and yet here they were again, standing amid the ashes, rewriting the city's rules, one inspection at a time. Nero's orders came swiftly. Within weeks of the fire's end, his scribes and architects announced a comprehensive new building code, the first of its kind in Rome's history. It was meticulous, prescriptive, and characteristically Neronian in its attention to both form and display. Streets were to be widened to prevent the spread of fire. Walls separating houses were to be built of stone or brick, not timber. Courtyards must be included in large buildings to allow for light and ventilation. No shop dealing in flammable materials could operate beneath a dwelling. These were sensible measures, born of necessity, yet their enforcement fell to the vigils, who were unprepared for the avalanche of oversight now expected of them. Their old duties of firefighting and patrol were joined by endless inspections, disputes, and forms. Every new foundation had to be measured, every wall had to be certified as non-flammable. For the first time in Roman history, construction became a matter not of private initiative, but public compliance. The vigils had become bureaucrats with soot still under their nails. The excubatorium, their headquarters, transformed from a barracks into something resembling an office. The walls that once hung with axes and hooks now held wooden shelves lined with wax tablets. Each tablet bore the record of a property, its owner, materials, and inspection notes. One chamber became a map room, where scribes tracked progress district by district. Another served as a tribunal for disputes between landlords and builders. The men who had once sprinted through the streets with buckets now spent their days seated at benches, squinting at records, muttering about measurements. For some, it was a relief, a slower life, safer than the night patrols. For others, it was a kind of death by paperwork. Gaius Marcellus, the veteran vigil who had fought the flames at the Circus Maximus, found himself assigned to administrative duty. His days were filled with reports of non-compliance. House on the Via Nova, timber wall not replaced. Bakery of Marcus Attilius, oven too near partition. Each line of text felt like a whisper from a city trying to forget its own suffering. The emperor, meanwhile, was not content with simple reconstruction. He saw in the ashes an opportunity for transformation, a chance to make Rome not just safer, but grander, more symmetrical, more theatrical. He ordered wide boulevards, colonnades, fountains, and gardens. The heart of his plan was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an enormous palace complex stretching across the Palatine and Esquiline hills. To Nero's admirers, it was genius. To his critics, madness. To the Vigiles, it was logistics. They were tasked with managing the supply of building materials, ensuring safe storage of lime, marble, and timber. They enforced rationing of water for construction and recorded shipments from quarries. Each shipment was registered on tablets, stamped with the imperial seal, and filed in the growing archives of the Excubatorium. It was tedious, precise work, but through it, Rome's transformation took shape. Despite these efforts, distrust lingered. Rumors persisted that Nero himself had ordered the fire, or at least allowed it to spread, to clear space for his palace. The Vigiles, as imperial servants, found themselves blamed by association. Crowds sometimes jeered at them during inspections. "Where were you when the city burned?" they shouted. "Did you not see the emperor's torches?" The men could say nothing. Their loyalty was not to the crowd, but to the state. They filed their reports and moved on, ignoring the insults. Even so, the sting remained. Many of them had risked their lives in those burning nights. Some had lost comrades. To be treated as conspirators felt like salt on old wounds. In the privacy of the barracks, they whispered their frustrations. They spoke of how politics always consumed the practical, of how their real work, keeping the city safe, was swallowed by rumor and spectacle. But bureaucracy has no ears. Ironically, as the city rebuilt, new dangers arose, not from flame, but from fraud. The Imperial Rebuilding Fund, vast and loosely managed, attracted opportunists. Landlords exaggerated losses, claiming compensation for properties that had survived. Builders cut corners, using cheaper materials to pocket the difference. The Vigiles were drawn into this web of deceit. They were to verify claims, inspect new buildings, and report misconduct. The work was slow and frustrating. Accusations were made and withdrawn. Evidence disappeared. Bribes changed hands. Some Vigiles, weary and underpaid, accepted coins to overlook violations. Others tried to maintain integrity, only to be punished for exposing powerful names. Rome's reconstruction became a mirror of its corruption, noble in intent, compromised in execution. Still, the system worked unevenly, imperfectly, but well enough. Within 5 years, the city had regained much of its former size. The new districts were wider, cleaner, and less flammable. The Senate, grudgingly, praised Nero's reforms. The public, though bitter about taxes and displacement, began to appreciate the safer streets. The Vigiles' records from this time, a handful of which survive in fragments, read like the minutes of a city's rebirth.
Inspection of the bakery of Julia Crispina.
Oven repositioned, compliant. New fountain installed at the Forum Holitorium. Water access satisfactory. District 3. No fires reported this month. They are dull lines, almost painfully so. But in their monotony lies civilization. For every dramatic account of emperors and conspiracies, there are thousands of these small notes, the quiet, methodical evidence of survival. By 68 CE, Nero's Rome gleamed in the sunlight. White marble facades reflected the sky. The streets smelled faintly of plaster and wet stone. The fountains sparkled. And yet, beneath the grandeur, discontent smoldered. The costs of rebuilding had strained the treasury. Taxes rose. Provinces grumbled. Soldiers muttered about loyalty. The Vigiles, once the symbols of order, now found themselves caught in another fire. Political, not literal. Whispers reached the barracks. Governors in Gaul were rebelling. The Senate was restless, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, had begun to waver in their devotion. Rome's new walls were fireproof, but its empire was not. When the revolt finally erupted and Nero fled the city, the Vigiles remained. They guarded the streets as they always had, watching once again as flames of a different kind consumed the order they had helped build. After Nero's death, the city did not collapse. It simply continued, quietly, mechanically, almost indifferently. The Vigiles resumed their patrols under Galba, Otho, and Vespasian, who kept the core intact. The new emperors valued their stability, their records, and their ability to make Rome function while power changed hands above them. To the Vigiles, it did not matter who ruled. The rules of fire were older than politics. They patched walls, inspected lamps, and fined careless bakers. Their bureaucracy endured, dull, persistent, unheroic. But Gaius Martellus, older now, would sometimes look out across the rebuilt city and remember that first night, the red sky, the screams, the impossible heat. The marble Rome around him was beautiful, yes, but he knew what lay beneath it. Layers of ash, buried like memory, waiting for wind. Civilization, he thought, is only ever borrowed from disaster. And so he kept his records, walked his rounds, and tried not to think about the inevitability of the next fire, whether of wood or of men. Because in Rome, it was never a question of if, only when. The new Rome rose from its ashes like a carefully catalogued memory. Its streets were wider, its buildings stronger, its facades brighter. But beneath the order, beneath the laws, the marble, the inspection scrolls, the city still pulsed with anxiety. Fire had taught Rome that perfection was temporary. For the men who patrolled the streets each night, the Vigiles, keepers of calm and witnesses of ruin, that lesson became their purpose. They were no longer simply extinguishers of flame. They had become something subtler, custodians of the fragile peace between safety and indifference. The decades after Nero's death were years of slow recovery and deliberate forgetting. The emperors who followed him, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, understood the importance of stability. They avoided Nero's extravagance, but kept many of his practical measures. The Vigiles, once tainted by association with the Golden House, found themselves rehabilitated. The Flavian emperors expanded the excubatoria across the city, ensuring that every district had its own station. New aqueducts provided more reliable water for firefighting. Training improved. The corps received better pay, uniforms, and even small pensions. Titus, who would later oversee relief efforts after the eruption of Vesuvius, had a particular sympathy for them. In 79 CE, when a fire broke out near the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, he personally joined the bucket lines, working alongside the Vigiles as flames licked the marble columns. The story spread quickly. The emperor who fought fire with his own hands. It was good propaganda, of course, but it also spoke to a shift in Roman thinking. For the first time, prevention and preparedness were seen not as mere administration, but as virtues of statecraft. The true monument of these years was not a temple or an arch, but a collection of wax tablets. In them, the vigiles recorded every inspection, every fine, every small fire. The Tabulae Vigilum, as they came to be known, formed a running chronicle of urban life. 6th day before the Ides of May, small fire at the bakery of Publius Livius, extinguished without loss. Calends of July, inspection of new insula at the Vicus Longus, walls found in compliance. 8th day before the calends of December, arrest of lamp maker for storing oil in excess of permitted measure. Each entry is dry, factual, and free of emotion. Yet together, they reveal a city held together by attention, not ambition. Through the slow rhythm of their notes, Rome maintained a kind of bureaucratic heartbeat. The vigiles were not heroes, not even in their own eyes. They were, as one later writer described them, custodes quietis, guardians of quiet. They ensured that the extraordinary, the fire, the panic, the collapse, remained exceptional. Their success was invisible by design. Imagine them, years after the Great Fire, still patrolling. It is the reign of Domitian now. The empire is at peace. The city sleeps. Gaius Martellus, older and slower, walks with 2 recruits down a narrow lane on the Aventine Hill. The moonlight glints on tiled roofs. The city is silent except for the soft hum of insects and the distant creak of water wheels. They stop occasionally to check oil lamps, to make sure no straw or debris has gathered near doorways. They exchange few words. Rome has changed, but the rhythm of their patrol has not. At one corner, a baker still kneads dough in the dim light, his oven glowing like a small sun. The smell of warm bread drifts into the street. Gaius watches it, remembering that night years ago when the same smell became a warning. He nods to the baker and moves on. In a way he knows, the fire never truly ended, it just learned to sleep. To the ordinary Roman, the fire of 64 CE became a story told by grandparents, then by books. By the time of Trajan, it was a cautionary tale rather than a living wound. But for the vigiles, memory was discipline. Their training manuals referenced Nero's fire not as history, but as precedent. Every recruit was taught the sequence of mistakes that had allowed the blaze to spread: narrow streets, flammable roofs, delayed response. They studied it as soldiers study battles. Their inspections were guided by this inherited vigilance: a sagging balcony, an overfilled lamp, a missing wall partition. These were not small details. They were echoes of catastrophe. To modernize, this may seem tedious, but for them, the tedium was sacred. Each signature, each report, was an act of defiance against forgetfulness. By the 2nd century, the Corpus Vigilum had become a vast administrative machine. They coordinated with the Aquarii who managed the water supply, the aediles who oversaw public order, and the architecti who inspected buildings. Each cohort had its own offices, storerooms, and archives. Clerks copied reports onto papyrus for long-term storage. The archives were so extensive that later emperors had to assign librarians to manage them. This quiet bureaucracy, uncelebrated, undramatic, was one of Rome's great unseen achievements. It provided continuity across centuries of upheaval. When emperors were assassinated or cities sacked, the vigiles' records often survived, preserved in sealed chests beneath their stations. Their names rarely appear in the grand histories, yet their ledgers kept the empire's capital alive. Yet even order carries its own fragility. As the empire aged, complacency returned. By the 3rd century, resources dwindled. Corruption seeped once again into the ranks. Inspections were skipped, fines pocketed, maintenance delayed. The vigiles still patrolled, but their discipline waned. Small fires began to multiply, not great disasters, but signs of neglect. One anonymous record from the reign of Severus Alexander notes almost apologetically: frequent minor fires in the Subura, causes indeterminate, recommendations ignored. The sentence is weary, bureaucratic, and profoundly human. It could belong to any age. Even in decline, the empire remained capable of paperwork. When the Western Empire finally crumbled in the 5th century, the vigiles lingered like ghosts of order. The city they once guarded had shrunk to a fraction of its size. Many of their barracks stood empty. The aqueducts no longer ran. Grain ships from Egypt no longer arrived. Yet a few records suggest that even then, in the shadow of collapse, patrols continued. In one fragment, a scribe named Marcus Anicius signs his name beside a note, dated to 467 CE. Inspection of Insula, near the old forum lamp usage. Within regulation. No fires observed. It is one of the last known records of the Corpus Vigilum. 1,000 years of empire reduced to one line of text. One quiet reassurance. No fires observed. Perhaps on that night, the city was truly calm. Or perhaps the scribe wrote the line out of habit, to keep the illusion of order alive a little longer. Today, when archaeologists uncover the layers of ancient Rome, they find evidence of these men in the most unassuming places: fragments of terracotta water pumps, bronze lamp fittings, and scratched tablets listing supplies, buckets, ropes, axes. They find the foundations of excubatoria, sometimes built into later houses or churches. In one, on the Via della Sita Coorte, an inscription still reads: "Here served the 7th cohort of the vigiles. May their watch be eternal." It is not the boast of warriors, but the prayer of custodians. Their eternity was not in conquest or glory, but in continuity. To study them is to glimpse the quiet philosophy of maintenance, the idea that civilization is built not on grand acts, but on small, repetitive care. Every bucket filled, every lamp checked, every report filed, was a gesture against chaos. It is easy to overlook such gestures, both then and now. History prefers the spectacle, the fire, not the men who extinguished it. Yet without those unnoticed labors, Rome would have burned again and again, until nothing was left but smoke. Perhaps that is why their story endures in the margins of old records. A reminder that even empires rest on the patience of the ordinary. Stand now, in your imagination, where the Circus Maximus once stood, the place where the great fire began. The noise of the crowds is gone, the marble has turned to dust. But if you listen carefully, you might still hear faint sounds beneath the earth. The steady rhythm of footsteps, the splash of water, the murmur of men calling to one another in the night. They are still there, in a sense, the vigiles, walking their rounds through time. Their torches flicker against the walls of memory, their voices blending with the wind. Rome sleeps, as it always did, trusting that someone, somewhere, is watching. In the end, Nero's fire inspectors achieved something few emperors did. They made themselves unnecessary. Their vigilance built a habit so strong that it outlived the empire itself. And though their names are mostly lost, Gaius, Marcus, anonymous scribes and bucket men, their influence lingers wherever cities still burn, rebuild, and regulate. Modern firefighting, urban zoning, building codes, and disaster management all trace their ancestry, however faintly, to those first watches of the Roman night. They prove that civilization's endurance lies not in the brilliance of its rulers, but in the dull persistence of its caretakers. So when you next see a fire truck pass by, or a building inspector checking an exit light, think of them, the tired men of the Corpus Vigilum, walking their endless rounds under a soot-dark sky, believing, against all odds, that order could be made to last. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet persistence, they were right. Because even now, 2,000 years later, the city still smolders, and the watchers still keep their vigil. The reign of Domitian began, as so many Roman reigns did, with the illusion of restoration. It was 81 CE. The city still glittered from the Flavian rebuilding projects, begun by Vespasian and Titus. Fresh marble, new temples, the smell of wet stone after construction. The great Colosseum stood nearly complete, its vast arches catching the morning light. To the public, it was a symbol of continuity. To the emperor, it was a ledger. Domitian saw numbers where others saw glory. You might picture Rome as a world of marble and rhetoric, but beneath its grandeur was an empire obsessed with counting. Taxes, harvest yields, soldier pay, building materials. Every aspect of imperial life was recorded, measured, and audited. The Romans called it Ratio Rei Publicae, the account of the state. Augustus had started it with his famous Res Gestae, the list of what he had spent, built, and given. Later emperors had expanded the practice, turning governance into calculation. By the time of Domitian, accounting was not just an administrative task, it was a philosophy. The empire, he believed, could only survive if every grain of wheat, every coin, and every drop of olive oil was known, numbered, and stored. Shortly after taking power, Domitian ordered a comprehensive census, not just of people, but of property. He wanted to know how much land was cultivated, how many animals grazed, how many jars of oil were pressed in each province. It was an empire-wide exercise in control, and it required an army of clerks. In Rome, they worked in the Tabularium, the great record office at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Its corridors smelled of wax and parchment. Tables were covered with scrolls tied in colored cords, red for property, green for taxes, yellow for military accounts. The scribes sat in long rows, their fingers stained with ink, their backs bent in silence. They copied and recalculated, checked figures, and sent reports to the imperial treasury. It was monotonous work, but it gave shape to the invisible skeleton of the empire. Domitian himself took an unusual interest in these numbers. Unlike many emperors, who left accounting to their administrators, he personally reviewed financial reports. He demanded daily summaries of revenue and expenditure, signed with the official seals of the rationales, the imperial accountants. Suetonius, who despised him, wrote that Domitian would spend entire nights alone, examining the accounts of every province. Perhaps it was paranoia, perhaps it was fascination. He once summoned a provincial governor to the palace at dawn, asking why the census of goats in Bithynia showed a decline of 6% compared to the previous year. The governor stammered that disease had struck the herds. Domitian reportedly nodded, made a note, and dismissed him. That same afternoon he doubled the province's levy on hides. To him, governance was arithmetic, and arithmetic, like tyranny, demanded exactness. The imperial accountants Rationales Augusti occupied a strange place in Roman society. They were neither senators nor slaves, but something in between, freedmen, often educated Greeks or provincials, trained in mathematics and record-keeping. They lived in modest houses near the Capitoline, worked long hours, and were paid irregularly. Yet they wielded immense quiet influence. A well-placed clerk could ruin a governor or rescue a city with a stroke of his stylus. Their tools were simple: wax tablets, styluses, a bucci with bronze counters, and strings of pebbles for reckoning sums. But their reach was vast. Through their ledgers flowed the pulse of empire, the taxes of Spain, the grain of Egypt, the silver of Dalmatia. Among these clerks was one named Tiberius Claudius Secundus. He was a small man with poor eyesight and a nervous habit of tapping his stylus against his teeth. His title was Adiutor Rationalis, assistant accountant, third class. He began his day before dawn, walking through the mist along the Tiber, clutching a basket of documents wrapped in linen. He worked in a vaulted chamber with 7 other men, each responsible for one region of the empire. His task to reconcile the monthly tax receipts from the province of Africa with the shipping records at Ostia. The work was endless and strangely hypnotic. Columns of numbers blurred into one another, time dissolved into addition and subtraction. But sometimes, in the quiet of the afternoon, he would pause and think of the world behind those numbers. The farmers under the African sun, the ships creaking across the sea, the bakers kneading dough from the grain he tracked only as statistics. He would wonder, faintly, if anyone else thought of them. Domitian encouraged this kind of abstraction. He wanted his clerks to think not of people, but of quantities. He would visit the tabularium unannounced, moving silently between the tables, his gaze sharp and cold. The men froze when they saw him. The only sound was the soft scrape of styluses. He would pick up a scroll, glance at the figures, and ask a single question, always simple, always precise. Why does the total differ by 12 denarii from the previous month? Who authorized this shipment? What was the cost of plaster in Nicomedia last season? Sometimes the answer mattered, sometimes it did not. What mattered was that the question was asked, a reminder that numbers were not anonymous. To serve Domitian was to live in perpetual audit.
Mistakes, even small ones, could be dangerous. One winter morning, a young scribe in Secundus's chamber miscopied a figure, transposing a C for an L, turning 50 into 100. The discrepancy was found during review. The sum itself was trivial, a few dozen denarii missing from a tax return, but Domitian's inspector demanded explanation. The young man confessed and was dismissed. The next day, his desk was empty, his name erased from the roll. No one spoke of him again. The fear of error hung over the office like incense. Each man double-checked his work, tracing every number with trembling care. Yet beneath the fear, there was also a strange satisfaction. The sense of belonging to a vast, intricate organism, where each figure mattered. It was bureaucracy as faith. Domitian extended this numerical discipline beyond finance. He ordered regular censuses of temples, libraries, even livestock. He measured the height of aqueducts, the width of bridges, the yield of vineyards. His private chambers, it was said, contained shelves of tablets filled with such data, a library not of philosophy or poetry, but of numbers. When questioned by a senator about the purpose of all this measurement, he reportedly replied, as a treatise on nomen. It was a chilling simplicity, and in its way, prophetic. For Domitian, numbers were not abstractions. They were instruments of certainty in an uncertain world. As months turned into years, the empire grew quieter under this regime of arithmetic. Taxes were collected more efficiently, the treasury filled, Corruption, though not eradicated, became harder to hide. But something else began to fade too: the warmth of human governance, the flexibility that once balanced Rome's iron structure. Everything was scheduled, monitored, recorded. Officials lived in fear of audits. Governors wrote reports twice over, lest a mistake reach the emperor's eye. Even festivals were timed and budgeted with mathematical precision. The empire had become a machine of compliance, its rhythm steady, its pulse mechanical. To many, it was peace. To others, it was suffocation. One evening, after the others had left, Secundus lingered at his desk. The oil lamp flickered. He stared at a column of figures representing the grain supply from Alexandria, 8,421 modii. He imagined the warehouses at Ostia, the smell of dust and sea air, the ships rocking in the tide. He wondered how many hands had touched that grain before it reached his wax tablet. How many farmers, sailors, porters, bakers. Then he erased a smudge, corrected a line, and sealed the tablet with his signet. In the quiet, he thought, perhaps this was the true meaning of empire, not conquest, not law, but record-keeping. To write down the world so that it might continue tomorrow. Domitian, meanwhile, had begun to withdraw from the city. He spent more time in his palace, issuing decrees by letter. His passion for numbers deepened into obsession. He demanded ever more detailed reports, daily updates, hourly tallies, comparative charts of rainfall and revenue. The senators grew resentful. The people grew weary. To them, his order felt cold and joyless, a peace built on surveillance. But to Domitian, it was perfection, a Rome measured, balanced, and predictable. And yet, as every accountant knows, perfection on paper rarely survives contact with reality. Even the most careful ledger cannot predict the moment when confidence collapses. When men stop believing in the numbers cease to matter. And soon, as whispers of conspiracy began to spread through the marble halls, the emperor who counted everything would discover that there were things no census could contain. It was said that under Domitian, the empire learned to whisper. Not in rebellion, but in calculation. Every household, every market stall, every vineyard learned to measure its own existence with the precision that the emperor demanded. Men counted their coins before paying taxes. Merchants weighed their grain twice, and farmers hid part of their harvest behind carefully balanced ledgers. Numbers had become both shield and weapon, the language of survival in a world ruled by arithmetic. By 88 CE, Domitian's census had expanded beyond the merely practical. He now required detailed inventories of temples and sacred groves. Priests were instructed to list the number of statues, the weight of silver votives, even the lengths of incense sticks stored in their shrines. One surviving tablet from the Temple of Isis on the Campus Martius records, in neat cursive Latin: on the 7th day before the calends of October, counted 126 oil lamps, 14 damaged 38 bronze bowls, 22 ivory figurines of Osiris, 6 robes of fine linen. The priest who wrote it must have known the absurdity, and yet he obeyed. To fail to count was to risk suspicion. Domitian's logic was simple. That which could be counted could be controlled. In Rome, the accountants, the rationales Augusti, became the silent core of this expanding bureaucracy. Their offices grew crowded with scrolls, wax tablets, and lead seals. Each morning they received sealed reports from across the empire, from Gaul, Spain, Egypt, and the eastern provinces. Each evening they dispatched their own summaries to the Palatine, where Domitian's secretaries awaited them. No one outside their ranks truly understood the scale of their work. They managed not only finances, but also intelligence. Among the grain figures and tax accounts were hidden reports on governors, letters of complaint, and coded remarks about disloyalty. The accountants had become auditors of morality. If a provincial officer spent too much on repairs, it might suggest corruption. If a temple reported fewer offerings, perhaps the people had grown restless. The empire's conscience was now kept on wax and papyrus. Our clerk, Tiberius Claudius Secundus, had by now risen to second rank. He was diligent, cautious, invisible, precisely the kind of man Domitian's system favored. One afternoon, while reconciling grain figures from Africa and Sicily, he noticed a small discrepancy. The numbers did not match, a difference of 4,000 modii of wheat. It was not enough to alarm anyone, but large enough to invite curiosity. The shipments from Carthage and Syracuse were recorded as received, yet the warehouse inventories at Ostia were lower than expected. He checked and rechecked the sums. No clerical error. The numbers were real. That evening, when he mentioned it quietly to his superior, the man frowned and told him to leave the matter. Some things, he said, belong to the emperor's column. Secundus understood. In the ledgers, there was always a column reserved for the emperor's own accounts, unexamined, unquestioned. He dipped his stylus in ink and wrote the figures there, without comment. The discrepancy vanished. While the accountants worked in silence, Domitian was building. His new palace on the Palatine Hill, the Domus Flavea, was a masterpiece of order. Every hall was symmetrical, every courtyard mathematically proportioned. The floors were laid in geometric mosaics, the ceilings measured by perfect ratios. He insisted that the architects show him each plan in exact scale. He corrected their measurements himself, using a ruler made of ivory. When construction finished, he walked the halls in silence, his footsteps echoing off the marble. To him, the palace was not merely a residence, it was an embodiment of his philosophy. An empire rendered in architecture, precise, symmetrical, eternal. And yet, even here, imperfection crept in. Marble cracked, gold leaf flaked, servants disobeyed. Numbers could measure materials, but not loyalty. Domitian's obsession with precision began to bleed into his treatment of people. He ordered secret registers of senators' speeches, soldiers' letters, and even the price of bread in local markets. His informers were everywhere, disguised as tax collectors, builders, librarians, even clerks. Each reported not only on politics, but on compliance, which governors delayed reports, which temples miscounted funds, which citizens mocked imperial decrees. To maintain the illusion of omniscience, Domitian used the ledgers themselves as instruments of intimidation. He would summon an official and recite, without looking at any scroll, the exact revenues of his province, the names of his subordinates, even the weight of marble imported for his house. It seemed supernatural, but in truth, the emperor's informers supplied him daily with these details. The empire had become a spreadsheet of fear. Accuracy, however, was costly. The more precisely the empire counted, the more fragile its order became. Each province, fearful of audits, began to falsify records. Some inflated figures to please the emperor, others concealed shortages to avoid punishment. The ledgers filled with contradictions. Ships were reported as docked in 2 harbors at once. Warehouses claimed to hold more grain than existed in all of Sicily. The numbers no longer described reality. They created their own. Domitian did not see this. To him, the reports were truth itself. If the records said the harvest was good, then the harvest was good. If they said the people were content, then they were content. The empire was perfect on paper. It was during one of these years that Secundus was summoned to the Palatine at night. He entered the palace through a side corridor, his footsteps muffled by polished stone. The guards said nothing. In a small chamber lined with scrolls, he found the emperor seated at a marble table. Before him lay a wax tablet, one of Secundus's own reports. Domitian looked up, his expression unreadable. "You are thorough," he said. "Your figures are consistent. That is rare." Secundus bowed his head. Domitian tapped the tablet. "You marked a discrepancy last month, 4,000 modii, placed under the imperial column. You were told to leave it there. Do you know what became of that grain?" Secundus hesitated. "No, Caesar." Domitian leaned forward. "It fed my guard for a month. Efficiency requires discretion." He smiled faintly, not warmly but approvingly. "You will continue as before. You understand the value of silence." Then he dismissed him. Outside, the night air felt cold and vast. Secundus realized that the emperor had not reprimanded him, but tested him. In Domitian's Rome, trust was measured in what one chose not to record. As the years passed, Domitian's fixation deepened into paranoia. He began issuing decrees that seemed both trivial and absolute. All vineyards exceeding a certain acreage must be reduced by 1/10. All statues of the emperor must be weighed annually to prevent theft of metal. All senators must submit expense accounts of their personal households. Each decree produced more paperwork, more inspections, more anxiety. The empire became an organism drowning in its own records. Secundus often worked until dawn, eyes burning, transcribing endless reports that no one would ever truly read. Once, while sealing a shipment manifest, he thought, "This is how the world ends, not in fire, but in counting." In the provinces, resentment simmered. Governors feared to make independent decisions. Merchants bribed auditors to alter weights. Soldiers joked that a man could die of age before his pay was processed. But open rebellion was unthinkable. The emperor's presence was everywhere, in every ledger, every tax, every column of sums. So the revolt took another form: quiet non-compliance. Figures were rounded, reports delayed, words miscopied. The empire began to drift slightly out of alignment with its own accounts, like a mechanism losing rhythm. Domitian sensed this dissonance, though he could not identify its source. He ordered more inspections, more purges of officials, more calculations. The more he counted, the less he understood. One night, Secundus dreamed that he was standing before a massive stone tablet covered in numbers. Each figure pulsed with light, as if alive. When he tried to read them, they began to move, columns shifting, sums rewriting themselves, erasing and reappearing. He realized the tablet was endless. Every time he added a number, another appeared. Then he woke, heart pounding, the echo of his stylus still in his hand. The dream lingered, a sense that the empire itself was becoming the same, a calculation without conclusion. In 95 CE, whispers began to circulate through the tabularium. Something was wrong at the top. The emperor had executed several high officials, including members of his own family, accusing them of conspiracy. He demanded new audits of every treasury and temple fund. The clerks worked without pause, filling scrolls with fresh figures. But even as they wrote, rumors spread that Domitian's own finances were failing. The imperial treasury, once overflowing, was mysteriously short. Where had the money gone? No one knew. The ledgers, once instruments of truth, now hid as much as they revealed. Some said the emperor had spent it on fortifications and games. Others whispered that his accountants falsified the sums to please him. Secundus saw it in the numbers, columns that no longer added up, shipments that never arrived, receipts with erased signatures. It was as if the empire itself had begun to cook its books. By autumn, Domitian rarely left his palace. He no longer trusted his senators, his soldiers, or even his secretaries. Only the ledgers remained loyal. He spent hours in his study, surrounded by tablets and scrolls, recalculating the same figures over and over. The more he counted, the smaller the empire became, reduced to numbers he could still control. Outside, the real world continued. Markets opened, ships sailed, people lived and died. But in Domitian's mind, Rome existed only as arithmetic. And perhaps that was his final refuge, a world of certainty, where betrayal could be erased with a line of ink. But certainty is a fragile thing. A single unbalanced account can undo a dynasty. And soon, as Secundus and his colleagues would discover, even the most careful ledger cannot conceal the deficit of trust. The year was 96 CE, and the empire was balanced upon the edge of a quill. Domitian ruled from behind locked doors. His decrees, once swift and meticulous, arrived late and contradictory. His accountants worked in darkness, copying figures they no longer trusted. To the outside world, Rome was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that hides exhaustion. The emperor's system, built on precision, had begun to decay from within. The ledgers were still filled, the scrolls still sealed, the reports still dispatched. But the meaning had drained away. The empire was still counting, but no one was sure what the numbers meant anymore. Domitian had made order his god, and yet the more he demanded of it, the more it receded. Each morning he reviewed his reports, the weights of silver reserves, the totals of harvested grain, the lists of soldiers' pay. He would find discrepancies and summon ministers in fury. Why is there a deficit? He would ask. Because the figures are false. Caesar at Gissa, one brave official whispered once. Domitian stared at him for a long moment. Then make them true, he replied. In that answer lay the essence of his rule. The empire was not to be understood. It was to be corrected until it matched his vision. One morning in early September, a sealed order reached the tabularium. It bore the imperial seal, an eagle clutching a thunderbolt, and a single line of instruction. Conduct a total audit of the treasury, including imperial expenditures. The command was unprecedented. No emperor had ever ordered his own finances examined. The accountants froze. To comply meant danger. To refuse meant death. Tiberius Claudius Secundus, by now chief assistant to the Rationalis, was chosen to oversee the initial review. He spent days in the archives, surrounded by columns of numbers that no longer matched. Funds that should have been present were missing. Taxes had been spent before they were collected. Expenditures were unrecorded. Incomes exaggerated. Domitian's perfect system had quietly collapsed into creative accounting. 1,000 tiny falsifications designed to keep his wrath at bay. It was not corruption alone. It was fear made visible on paper. Secundus and his team worked through the nights. The palace sent messengers demanding progress. The clerks whispered among themselves, knowing that the emperor was watching every step. By the fifth night, the truth could no longer be disguised. The imperial accounts were deeply unbalanced. The deficit was enormous, enough to fund 10 legions for a year. The numbers told a quiet but unmistakable story. Mismanagement, overbuilding, lavish spending on games and temples, and the slow bleed of resources through bribery and incompetence. When Secundus presented his preliminary findings to the Rationalis, the older man read them in silence, then placed the tablet face down. "You will not send this to the palace," he said. "But the order." "The emperor does not want truth. He wants confirmation." Secundus hesitated. "Then what should we give him?" The Rationalis looked tired. "Give him balance." So they recalculated. They adjusted columns. They moved debts into future years, erased shortfalls with creative conversions, and discovered surplus revenues in distant provinces. The audit became fiction. The fiction became law. When the report reached the palace, Domitian read it without expression. "Balanced," he murmured. "As I expected." He dismissed the messengers and returned to his study. That night, the emperor dined alone. The lamps flickered across the polished marble of his private chamber. He ate little. His mind was filled not with victory but with unease. The numbers were perfect, too perfect. For years he had trusted his ledgers, as others trusted gods. But now he sensed something hollow within them, an echo where certainty should be. He summoned his steward, Parthenius, and asked, "Are these figures true?" The steward bowed deeply. "They are what your majesty commanded them to be." Domitian said nothing. Later that night, the emperor sat awake, staring at the empty columns on an unfinished tablet. His hand trembled slightly. For the first time, he wondered if the empire he had built existed only on wax. The next day, an edict arrived at the tabularium, ordering the execution of 3 clerks accused of tampering with official records. Their supposed errors were trivial, duplicated tallies, minor misplacements. The real crime was different. They had noticed the false balance and whispered about it. Secundus was spared, perhaps because of his discretion, perhaps because he was invisible. He learned of their deaths when he arrived to find their desks cleared, their names scraped from the attendance list. He said nothing. In that silence, he understood what his profession had become. Not guardians of truth, but scribes of obedience. The empire no longer sought accuracy. It sought reassurance. By the final weeks of Domitian's reign, even his closest aides avoided him. He wandered his palace like a man lost in his own creation. He measured his food, he weighed his wine, he timed his sleep, and recorded it in tablets. The once glorious Domus Flavea was now a mausoleum of order. At times, he would summon accountants to read figures aloud, not because he needed the information, but because the rhythm of numbers soothed him. They were predictable, obedient, incapable of betrayal. Except, of course, when written by men. On the 18th of September, 96 CE, the reckoning came, not from the ledgers, but from the living. The emperor rose early, complaining of an uneasy dream. He summoned Parthenius, who told him that all was well. But the servants were nervous.
That morning, while Domitian examined a set of fresh accounts, a group of conspirators entered his chamber. The first blow struck him behind the ear. The wax tablet he held fell to the floor, smearing numbers into meaningless lines. When he died, the empire's most meticulous accountant left behind an unbalanced ledger, both literal and symbolic. The accountants were ordered to seal the records. The ledgers of Domitian's reign were never publicly audited. In the days that followed, Rome exhaled. The Senate, long humiliated, declared Domitian's memory damnatio memoriae. His name was chiseled off inscriptions, his statues destroyed,
his image erased. In the tabularium, Clark scratched his name from the headings of thousands of documents. The columns beneath were left untouched. Numbers survive where names do not. Secundus continued to work under the new emperor Nerva. The tone changed. Fewer decrees, fewer inspections, a gentler order. But the habits of arithmetic remained. Rome had learned that it could not rule without its accountants. Under Nerva and Trajan, the bureaucracy flourished again, more rational, less fearful, but still guided by the same quiet principle: to know the empire through its measurements. The tabularium expanded. Clerks were trained in new methods of record-keeping. Decimal notations began to appear beside Roman numerals. Reports became more standardized, less ornate. The spirit of Domitian, stripped of paranoia, but not of method, endured. It was his strange gift to history, a template for the management of complexity. Later empires, Byzantine, Islamic, medieval European, would all inherit the same instinct, that order begins with the ledger. Tiberius Claudius Secundus lived long enough to see his own son join the service. In his last surviving tablet, dated to the 2nd year of Trajan's reign, he wrote, "Accounts of the province of Africa confirmed, shipments verified, the sums agree. Deo gratias." A simple note, factual, unadorned. Yet beneath it lies the echo of everything he had witnessed. Fear, obedience, collapse, and recovery, all contained in the act of balancing a column. When he died, his stylus was placed in his hand, as if to remind him that even in death, the empire expected precision. Domitian's accountants did not build monuments or conquer nations. Their legacy was subtler. They taught Rome, and the world after Rome, that numbers could govern men as surely as swords. Their ledgers were instruments of peace and oppression alike, shaping how rulers imagined control. In their monotony lay both the empire's endurance and its fragility. For every empire that follows Rome, from parchment to spreadsheet, repeats their paradox. That order, once absolute, becomes indistinguishable from fear. If you visit the Capitoline Hill today, you can still see the remnants of the tabularium. The arches are empty, the rooms silent. Pigeons nest where scribes once bent over their tablets. But in the cracks of the walls, archaeologists have found fragments of wax and bits of bronze counters, the fossilized remains of arithmetic. They speak, in their own mute way, of a time when men believed the world could be balanced, when perfection could be written in columns. It is a comforting illusion, even now. And as you imagine those long, silent halls filled with the sound of scratching styluses, perhaps you can hear the faint echo of Domitian's final command, the command that still haunts every empire that measures itself too carefully. Count everything. When you imagine the life of a Roman emperor, you might picture gold and marble, banquets stretching into the night, musicians playing soft melodies, while courtiers laugh in polished tones. But beneath that glittering surface, there was something far quieter. A ritual repeated at every meal, born not of luxury but of dread. Before the emperor ever lifted a morsel to his lips, another man tasted it first. That man was the praegustator, the official taster. His duty was simple: to eat what the emperor would eat, to drink what the emperor would drink, and, if necessary, to die so that his master might live. It was a profession both intimate and invisible, where loyalty was measured in swallowed risk and silence. The praegustator rarely appears in the grand accounts of Rome, He does not feature in Tacitus's fiery speeches or Suetonius's scandalous tales. But he was always there, standing just behind the emperor's chair, watching the plates as they were set down, the goblets as they were poured. His existence was a kind of shadow government, the invisible machinery that kept the empire fed and its ruler alive. The position was formalized under Augustus, who distrusted nearly everyone but the gods. He appointed slaves of Greek or Cappadocian origin to the role, foreigners without strong Roman connections, chosen precisely because they lacked the power to conspire. These men were trained in the etiquette of dining, the chemistry of suspicion, and the reading of faces. Their art was survival, not of themselves, but of the emperor. In the imperial kitchens, long before a meal was presented, a miniature army of cooks, stewards, and tasters moved in silent choreography. Each dish was prepared in duplicate, one for the emperor, one for testing. The praegustatores began their work before the emperor ever sat down. They examined spices for irregular colors, tasted sauces for bitterness, sniffed wines for unusual aromas. They knew poisons not by name, but by symptom: the tingling of the tongue, the metallic taste at the back of the throat, the faint numbness that followed certain herbs. Their education was practical and dangerous. Apprentices trained with older tasters, learning how to measure time, for poison acted not in moments, but in minutes. And the taster's job was to delay death long enough for the emperor to notice. A good praegustator did not die quickly. He was expected to endure, to provide warning, to collapse at the right moment. The first emperor, Augustus, understood poison the way a sailor understands storms. He had seen it destroy rivals and friends. He trusted almost no one, not even his own wife Livia, whose cool intelligence and command over domestic politics were legendary. Suetonius later wrote that Augustus ate little and with suspicion. His meals were simple: figs, fish, barley cakes. Yet each was pre-tasted. Even his water, drawn from private wells, was tested. The emperor believed moderation was the best defense against excess, and perhaps against murder. For the praegustator, Augustus's reign was almost peaceful. Few plots reached the dining table. The tasters became part of the imperial rhythm. A swallow of wine, a pause, the emperor's nod. A ritual so ingrained that it ceased to feel paranoid. But with his death came change. Tiberius, who followed Augustus, trusted no one at all. He transformed the act of eating into a public test of loyalty. Every meal became theatre. The praegustator stood before all, taking his bites in deliberate sequence. Tiberius watched, silent and unblinking. Guests were expected to wait, sometimes for minutes, as the taster chewed and swallowed. It was not just about safety, it was about control. For Tiberius, the food taster symbolized the entire empire, one man consuming risk so that another might rule in calm. His household became obsessed with poisons. Scholars were invited to lecture on toxins derived from lead, hemlock, and the Acochanthera tree. The kitchens resembled laboratories. Yet no confirmed poisoning ever occurred during his reign, perhaps because fear itself proved the most effective antidote. By the time of Claudius, the ritual had grown elaborate. He too inherited the system, but his curiosity turned it into something more, almost an experiment. Claudius, a scholar emperor with a taste for minutiae, personally oversaw the cataloguing of foods and potential toxins. His servants kept meticulous notes. Which mushrooms could cause dizziness, which wines fermented too long, which metals tainted storage jars. He even established a poison archive, samples preserved in sealed jars, labeled and recorded, to study how they changed over time. But his scientific interest was his undoing. For Claudius, unlike Augustus, was not careful whom he trusted. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was ambitious, and her son Nero waited impatiently for the throne. One night in 54 CE, Claudius sat at dinner. The meal was simple: roast mushrooms. His praegustator, Halotus, followed the usual procedure, sampling each dish, waiting for signs. There were none. Claudius began to eat. Ancient writers never agreed on what happened next. Some said the poison was mixed only after Halotus had tasted. Others claimed the dosage was delayed by slow digestion. Tacitus, ever the dramatist, described Claudius choking, calling for help, and finally collapsing while servants pretended to assist him. What is known is this: the emperor's praegustator survived. For Halotus, that survival was not victory, but suspicion. When Nero ascended the throne, he inherited not only the empire, but the same cautious rituals. Halotus remained in service, a living reminder of one emperor's death and another's rise. The praegustator became once more both witness and ghost. Under Nero, food tasting became institutionalized. The position expanded into an entire department. The Officium Praegustatorum. Dozens of men were employed to oversee meals, each ranked according to the danger of the dishes they examined. Lower-ranking tasters handled bread, olives, and fruit. Senior tasters inspected meats and sauces. The chief praegustator, always a freedman of proven loyalty, was responsible for tasting the emperor's wine. They wore uniforms of plain white linen to show that they carried no hidden implements. Their tools were simple: small knives, spoons, and bronze dishes for sample testing. Each banquet followed the same ritualized procedure. The tasters moved first, each sampling from their assigned plate. Then came the pause. Guests waited, conversation stilled. All eyes watched for any change. A shiver, a cough, a tremor. Only when the chief taster nodded did the emperor raise his own fork. 1,000-year-old empire, and dinner always began with hesitation. It might seem tedious, even absurd, but this system of safety became one of the empire's most stable bureaucracies. Records show that the Officium Praegustatorum persisted into the 4th century CE, long after the early emperors had vanished. The department drew salaries, kept rosters, and received grain allowances. In many ways it mirrored the empire itself: cautious, procedural, self-perpetuating. There were rules for everything: how many bites to take, how long to wait, when to signal approval. Regulations even dictated the order of tasting for different ingredients. For example, honey was always tested last, since its sweetness could mask bitterness. Every possible variation of danger was codified. The empire had learned that survival could be organized, just as taxes and armies could. It is easy to mock the food tasters as instruments of fear, but for the men who held those positions, their work required quiet courage. A taster's life expectancy was uncertain. Many died not from poison but from stress, indigestion, or sheer exhaustion. They ate little outside their duties, fearing contamination. They were both essential and disposable. Yet some attained modest prestige. The emperor's survival depended on them, and a skilled taster could earn trust rare in imperial circles. Halotus himself, despite his association with Claudius's death, was rewarded under Nero. perhaps because he had learned what few dared to learn. That proximity to danger is sometimes the safest place to stand, if you stand quietly enough. To most of the empire, the ritual of tasting was invisible. But in the imperial household, it structured every day. Meals began at the same hour. The dishes arrived in the same order. The pauses between bites were measured like a ceremony. Over time, the fear dulled into habit. The praegustatores became part of the furniture, silent, reliable, ignored. That is how systems endure. Not through terror, but through repetition. And so it was that by the reign of Vespasian, the profession of food tasting had become as ordinary as that of the scribe or the guard. A dull necessity, no longer thrilling, merely administrative. The empire's paranoia had become paperwork. But there is an irony at the heart of this system. No taster could guarantee safety. A clever poisoner could find ways to bypass them by coating utensils, lacing perfumes, or using slow-acting toxins that would claim victims hours later. The praegustator was not protection, he was performance. The real purpose of his presence was reassurance, a ritual to quiet the emperor's mind. Every bite he took was a small, silent prayer to order, to procedure, to the illusion of control. And that illusion held for a time. Until one emperor, paranoid beyond reason, surrounded by enemies, and distrustful of even the testers themselves, decided that the only safe food was food that no one else had seen. His name was Domitian. As the flicker of oil lamps casts long shadows across the imperial dining hall, you can almost hear the careful clatter of spoons and the deliberate pauses between courses. The empire's appetite was not just for food, but for control, a hunger that could never quite be satisfied. But what happened when the system designed to protect the emperor began to consume itself? What became of the men who tasted fear for a living, when fear itself became the meal? By the time the Emperor Domitian came to power in 81 CE, Rome had perfected the art of control. Every gesture in the palace followed a rule. Every word was weighed before being spoken, and every dish that reached the imperial table had already passed through a chain of supervision longer than a legion's supply line. Domitian trusted no one, but he trusted the system. He did not dine for pleasure, he dined for order. Meals became the most visible expression of imperial discipline, a theatre of obedience played out 3 times a day. The emperor's dining chamber, known as the Triclinium Maius, was a masterpiece of calculated symmetry. 3 couches formed a perfect semicircle around the central table, each designated for a rank of guest. At the apex sat Domitian himself, beneath a ceiling painted with constellations. The emperor ate in the same measured rhythm as his celestial namesake, the god Jupiter. The arrangement was architectural reassurance, a visible map of hierarchy and safety. But within that geometry, the smallest deviation could signal disaster. If a servant stepped out of line, if a taster hesitated, if a cupbearer trembled, the pattern was broken, and with it, the illusion of control.